according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, Ukraine has a realistic possibility of breaking through the remaining Russian lines by the end of the year. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, so we're going to dive right in. This was an interview in The Economist recently with the Director of Analysis for the Defense Intelligence Agency, Trent Mall. Now, the Defense Intelligence Agency is one of many intelligence organizations in the United States, a lot more than most people probably think. But they're kind of under the radar. DIA doesn't get like nearly as much fanfare, books, and press as, say, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. DIA's focus is almost exclusively the military capabilities of our peers. So things they would be focused on, the submarine capabilities within the Chinese Navy. How many artillery pieces, functional artillery pieces, North Korea has pointed at their border with South Korea? How many stealth fighters and bombers Russia has in their inventory? That kind of thing. So when you think DIA, think military-focused intelligence. Now, there are a few things to consider when we're getting any assessment, be it formal or informal, like we have here in this interview, when it comes from an intelligence agency or really any official within the U.S. government. The first is that we're not getting the full picture. Just most of this is classified, right? Especially when you're talking about an intelligence organization. The vast majority of the work that they're doing and their assessments is going to be on the classified side, so it cannot be released. So what we're getting is what they can release and what they want to release. The second part is they have gotten things wrong in the past. DIA, just like any intelligence organization around the world and in the United States, is far from perfect. So just because they say something doesn't automatically mean that it is true or it's going to pan out. That said, they do have a lot of people and a lot of resources focused exclusively on trying to understand Russia, Ukraine, and the dynamics of this war. So, I would hope that means as the war progresses, as they spend more time diving into it, that their assessments become more and more accurate. Now, looking back, Maul does explain how they may have overcorrected recently. Specifically, when looking at the first days of this war, the overwhelming consensus was that Russia was going to win this war, and potentially pretty quickly. They just say that on paper, it wasn't a fair fight. Russia outmatched Ukraine in almost every category that the DIA was focused on, which again is very military-specific types of intelligence. But they say that some recent events kind of made them overcorrect in that direction that they're trying to get right now. They look at when the Iraqi army in 2014 didn't hold up as expected as Islamic State poured across the country. And then again in Afghanistan, when we helped train the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police and all of those forces. And then as soon as there kind of became a crack in the armor, they essentially crumbled overnight. And that then, when, there is a correlation to a degree of you've got these Iraqi and Afghan forces that were trained by the United States, NATO, and Western militaries. And then to a degree, Ukrainian forces had training with NATO elements prior to this invasion, prior to the Russian invasion. So the DIA is saying they looked at that a little bit. And with that comparison, they weren't able to say with any confidence that the Ukrainian forces would be able to, for any significant period of time, withstand the assault from the weight of the full Russian military. They added, though, that this has brought about, the fact that Ukraine is still very much in this fight a year and a half later. They've had to start looking at more intangibles. And I think, when you hear that, you say, of course, you have to do that. Things like morale and leadership, and they'll get into some of the specifics of what they're looking at, but that's so much easier said than done. Anyways, moving on, they say, as a comparison between what we saw play out in Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal and how the Taliban took over, in the blink of an eye, versus Ukraine holding the battlefield in those opening hours, days, weeks, and eventually kind of stopping the Russian military in their tracks. Maul says this is all a part of national factors, something that they're trying to consider in future assessments. For instance, he says, Zelensky's insistence on staying in Kyiv compared with Ghani's decision to flee Kabul can affect the battlefield. It points to the importance of leadership on the front lines, an army's esprit de corps, the strength of its command and control, and whether it enjoys sustained logistical and medical support. A little easier to understand if a force has a logistical network, if they have the ability to care for their wounded soldiers and evacuate them off the battlefield. But the strength of command and control, that's tough. And the Army esprit de corps, come on. You think about this was very prevalent in my opinion, on social media in the opening days and weeks of the war. There were videos coming out of captured Russian POWs talking about how we don't want to be here. We don't want to fight this war. We don't know what we're doing. We have no food. We have no ammo. And it painted a very skewed picture, in my opinion. You've got the guys that surrendered and that are no longer with their military, that are in captivity from an enemy force. You can't take what they say at face value. So I think at the very beginning of the conflict, we overestimated how bad Russian morale was, right? And at the same time, you've started to see that play out on the other side. If you're following Russian Telegram channels, you'll see regularly they capture Ukrainian soldiers and they'll put them on camera and they'll tell horror stories about what life is like in the Ukrainian military. And you can't take those as evidence of how things are across the entire force, right? It's a one-off, and you don't know the reasons that they're saying the things that they are saying. So anyways, something that the DIA is looking at, but very, very hard to calculate. In terms of what they are looking for going forward, Maul says that the DIA will be watching for signs that Russia can keep the flow of artillery ammunition to the front lines and maintain leadership at the local level. He concedes that American and Ukrainian officials failed to appreciate the depth of Russia's defenses and how difficult it would be for Ukraine to smash through them with armor. Adding, Ukrainian generals have told the Guardian newspaper that 80% of Russia's effort went into building its first and second lines, but Mr. Maul cautions that the bulk of Russia's reinforcements remain at the third. This is something I brought up in a recent video. I said there were rumors starting to emerge that we've got these layered Russian defense, and big picture, the way you would expect that to play out is a limited force at the front, where the majority of the casualties are being inflicted by loitering munitions, artillery, aircraft, and minefields. You do have soldiers up there to help direct those fires and to provide direct fire to enemy forces, to Ukrainian forces as they're trying to cross that terrain. But the idea is that as Ukraine gets attrited through that minefield, there's no Russian forces really, or a very small amount of Russian forces that would be killed if they get overrun. But in the meantime, Ukraine continues to lose manpower and equipment. Then as that reduced Ukrainian element makes it into the second or third line of defense, all of a sudden, when they're operating now at 70, 50, 40% strength from when they started, is when they run up against the bulk of Russian forces. There were rumors recently, and this is what they're getting at here, that wasn't the case, and that Russia had been pushing more and more of their soldiers forward to try to stop Ukraine at the very earliest point. The challenge for Russia then is that those troops are all of a sudden within range of the majority of Ukrainian artillery systems, loitering munitions, even their helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft that are firing rockets close to the front line. So that had the potential to reduce Russia's combat power right at the front before Ukraine even makes it through the first line of defense. Maul here says he doesn't believe that's accurate. That's going to be something, we're not going to have a clear answer in the coming days, weeks, or months. That's probably going to be something that'll be more of a historical element. As this war wraps up, we'll find out what those force structures actually looked like. Maul continues talking about how there's been a lot of criticism as of late, leaking out into Western media, talking about how Ukraine hasn't been as successful as hoped. And part of that criticism has been people suggesting that, hey, they didn't listen to what NATO said. They didn't do this the way that NATO generals or U.S. generals suggested that they should. And Maul kind of pushes back on that. He says it's open for debate whether the Ukrainians have deployed the sort of tactics that you would hope would have made more aggressive gains in a shorter time. He adds that there are two more important variables than the tactics used so far. He says those are Ukraine's stockpile of ammunition, vital for sustaining the artillery barrages that enable progress, and the weather, which becomes a little bit wetter in autumn. So, interesting take there. I don't think that we can completely ignore the tactics that have been used on the battlefield. I don't know that removing that entirely really helps anything. I think it is worth looking at how this has played out. Ukraine appears to have chosen, roughly 3, we'll call it 2.5 axis of advance. Orhiv, Velika Novoselka, and then more of a fixing operation in Bakhmut. What NATO appears to have been pushing for was one location and really smash through those Russian lines and exploit the gap as it was created. I think it's a valid conversation. I think it'll help drive strategy going forward, not just for Ukraine, but for anybody observing the conflict. In our case, for the United States, as we consider what operations might look like in the future. But, you can't ignore the fact that without artillery ammunition, this thing is going to come to a grinding halt. And then, of course, as soon as the wet weather starts to kick in the autumn, it's really going to stop as well. We saw the same thing last year. It's nothing surprising there. There have been folks saying, look, this is the progress Ukraine has made after 18 months of Western supplied equipment and training. Is this what we're going to have to provide every single year? If that's the case, this thing is a stalemate, right? Or I don't know that we can realistically expect the volume and the frequency of Western aid flowing into Ukraine indefinitely that we had over the last 18 months. So there are people looking at that and saying, if this progress in the South over the last 6 weeks or so is what we get, we, Ukraine, NATO, the alliance together, what we get, this looks like a stalemate. It looks like this fight has kind of stagnated. And in line with that, a quote from a recent senior American intelligence official, anonymous outside of that, said, quote, "If you look at the battlefield in 5 years' time, it could look broadly similar." And he emphasized the fact that the quality of both Russian and Ukrainian forces is declining over time. That's hit or miss. I don't think that's something you want to hear if you're in one of those forces. I'd be upset if somebody told me that the organization I was a part of, the quality was declining over time. It's not, what they're getting at there is you start having to pull people into the force as casualties increase and losses increase. You start having to pull people into the force that you may not have looked at the first go round, right? And that's just going to happen as the attrition continues. You will see in both Russia and Ukraine as they become more strapped for manpower, whether it's now or 3 months or 3 years from now, they're going to start having to pull in people that are younger or maybe that weren't fit for military service in the first place or a little bit older, things like that. It's not a knock against Russia or Ukraine. That's just the nature of warfare of this scale as it plays out over time. But Mr. Maul here, the director of analysis of the DIA, is a little less gloomy on that front. He says that Surovikin, the Russian general who built the defensive lines, kind of responsible for the Russian defensive posture in the south, and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, were both responsible for Russia's most tangible gains of the past year, and they're gone. Prigozhin died in a plane crash a few weeks ago, and Surovikin, we saw some image recently of him looking a little disheveled. He's been on some sort of house arrest since the Wagner-initiated mutiny back in June. So they're both out of the picture. Mr. Maul points to that as a possibility to where Ukraine can take advantage. Some of the more successful Russian leaders are no longer in the fight. And that's where he says that he gives Ukraine a realistic possibility, which the article says is intel speak for a 40 to 50% probability of breaking through the Russian lines by the end of the year. But again, going back on what he said, the most important aspects are not the tactics and not whether or not it should be one axis of advance versus two versus three, but what will largely determine whether or not Ukraine is able to pull this off by the end of the year, which I guess he's talking about 3 months from now, 4 months from now. It's pretty quick. He says that the primary limitation there is going to be the availability of ammunition and the potential for worsening weather. But overall, I'd say it's a pretty rosy assessment. I thought it was worth sharing because a lot of the professional articles coming out recently, they've not been necessarily gloomy, but I would say realistic. Right there, it's very hard to look at this war and say with any confidence that anything major is going to happen in the span of 2-3 months. We just haven't seen that for a year and a half now. Things aren't moving rapidly. So a lot of the reports I've seen, analysts that I very much respect, they're not talking about one side or the other losing. It's more just discussing, hey, this is a slow grind. And it's not going fast. So realistically, this is a bit different. This is a senior intelligence official in the United States given a roughly 40 to 50% probability that we're going to see in the next few months greater progress, especially in the south of Ukraine, than we've seen in a long time, to be frank. So I guess we'll have to revisit at the end of the year and see just, how accurate Mr. Maul's assessment is here. But that's all I got for now. Again, a link to the original article is in the description below, as well as a link to the national security sit-reps I put out on a weekly basis on Substack. It's usually 7 to 9 articles along with links out to various sources so you can read a little bit more if interested, and when they come in, some good podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.